In the 1860s, Canada was a country in flux. Still a British colony at the beginning of the decade, there was substantial immigration to Canada from England, Scotland, Ireland, and the United States, and what was soon to become the nation of Canada was constantly growing. In the mid-19th century, sentiments began to stir that were part of a larger 19th century trend towards the creation of nation-states. In short, many hoped that the separate colonies of Canada West, Canada East, and the Maritimes would become unified through Confederation. Several factors contributed to the attractiveness of Canada's unity. The American Civil War in many ways introduced the idea of national independence into the minds of Canadians. However, as Canada had supported the South in the Civil War, they feared invasion by the Northern Yankees, and it was clear to many that unifying Canada would increase their defenses. The Fenian raids of 1866 also alerted Canadians to the need for a unified military. Another driving force in the journey towards Confederation was a growing industrial economy. Improvements in transportation and communication, like the railroad, the steamship, and the telegraph, meant that people could exchange information more easily, ship their goods to a wider market, and move themselves within a larger world. Although the average homesteader in Canada West or the fisherman in Nova Scotia might not care one way or the other about federal union, the political movers and shakers and their industrialist friends had a vision which they hoped would help business and prosperity while creating a new nation. London, in Canada West, was following this economic boom. The beginnings of industry in the colonies coincided with the decline of the old mercantile system, where Canada traded its wheat, lumber, and other raw materials for manufactured goods from England. Things like breweries, flour mills, shoe factories, ironworks, wagon manufacturers, and stonemasonries started to pop up all over London beginning in the 1850s. It's likely that many Londoners were supporters of Confederation, as tension was rife between the imperial military and the people of the city, and London industrialists were ready to make their mark on the world. Fortunately, Canada was able to avoid a war like the Americans had fought. By the 1860s, British attitudes about keeping a hold on their colonies had begun to grow lax, as they found the cost of maintaining government in the colonies too expensive. Canadian leaders presented the British North America Act to British Parliament in 1866, which proposed that Canada, while remaining loyal to Britain, would have its own federal government and delegate control to the provinces over local affairs. It also proposed the creation of the House of Commons, based on representation by population, and the Senate, based on regional representation. These proposals were accepted. The Dominion of Canada was created in 1867, and London officially became London, Ontario, Canada. The British Imperial troops were withdrawn from London shortly after Confederation. Londoners themselves may not have experienced any radical life changes as a result, but their political involvement, their businesses, and their social statuses were certainly affected. The Lee family, made up of Hiram, Elizabeth, and their 4 children, are an example of a London family who lived through the process of Confederation. Like many Londoners, Hiram was of Irish origin, and like many more, Elizabeth's family hailed from England. They lived on Waterloo Street. Hiram was born in 1833, and Elizabeth in 1937. The couple married in 1856, when Elizabeth was 19 and Hiram was 23. They welcomed their first child, James Hiram Lee, the following year. Their children Charles Henry, Emma Jane, and Albert soon followed. Hiram's work history, which was discovered via census records and city directories from the time, tells us a lot about the economic and life changes in the Confederation era. In 1861, he worked as a teamster, which meant that he drove a horse-drawn wagon in order to deliver goods around the city. At the time, as railroads were still being built, teamsters formed the backbone of Canada's economy and acted as guardians of the trade. As teamsters made very little money, it is unsurprising that Hiram also owned 2 horses himself and actively invested money in London businesses in order to capitalize on the rapid economic growth that was happening. Just 3 years later, Hiram began working at the W&J Carling Brewery as a brewer. The Carling family, early immigrants from England, had opened the brewery in 1818 as a small family business, which eventually grew with London's economy. It was one of the precursors to Molson Canadian Brewery, which still exists today. As the brewery experienced more success, Hiram was promoted to the role of clerk and agent 7 years into his employment. In the next decade, Hiram transitioned again to work with licensing. His movement from physical labor as a teamster towards a respectable job in industry management is indicative of London's upwardly mobile families in the 1860s. Hiram and Elizabeth's sons also held a variety of professions in London. James worked as a machinist before moving to Strathroy to marry. Charles worked as a tanner in London before his untimely death at age 29. Albert worked as a druggist for most of his life. Their daughter, Emma Jane, married William Edward Saunders in 1885, son of the famed agricultural scientist after whom Saunders Secondary School is named. A few years after the wedding, Hiram passed away of cancer at age 55. Elizabeth moved in with her daughter Emma and her new family. Elizabeth survived well into the new century, eventually passing away in 1916 of Bright's disease. They were both buried in Woodland Cemetery in a plot that Hiram had purchased in 1884. Buried with Hiram and Elizabeth are their sons, Charles and Albert, as well as Hiram's relatives, Thomas and Anne Lee, farmers who had died decades earlier. Back in the 1850s, when Thomas and Anne Lee passed away, Woodland Cemetery had not yet been opened. However, Woodland has a history that stretches back far before its existence. When London was being settled as a village, burials took place in the churchyard of St. Paul's Church and later Cathedral, beginning in the 1830s. In 1849, the town forbade any further burials in the churchyard because it was at the center of a populated area and had the potential to cause sanitation issues and spread disease. Bishop Benjamin Cronin, the rector of St. Paul's at the time, purchased 16 acres of land just east of London for the opening of the new St. Paul's Grove Cemetery. Most of the gravestones and remains from the crowded churchyard were moved to St. Paul's Grove, although 12 gravestones still remain on the grounds of St. Paul's Cathedral today, such as that memorializing the wife and son of Dr. Elam Stimson, who died in the cholera epidemic of 1832. Though hopes for the new cemetery were high, the rush of the Confederation era ensured that it wouldn't last long. London, as a city, was growing so quickly that it wasn't 30 years before the population had grown to completely surround this previously rural cemetery. Once again, in 1879, due to health concerns, a bylaw was passed prohibiting further burials there. A new site was selected on Pipeline Road, so far outside of London that the city could surely never expand around it. The farming property, previously known as Woodland Park, became Woodland Cemetery in 1879 and remains here on what is now Springbank Drive today. The process of moving the remains and gravestones over to Woodland Cemetery began in 1880 and took 6 years to complete. Many Londoners, such as Hiram and Elizabeth Lee, purchased family lots in Woodland to ensure that their loved ones, in this case Hiram's relatives, were moved safely to the site where they themselves would later be buried. Another illustrious example of London's industrial spirit was Thomas Fraser Kingsmill. Thomas was born in Tipperary, Ireland on April 6, 1840, and came to North America as an immigrant with his wife Anne in 1860. They settled in London in 1864, and, as many will recall, opened a dry goods shop called Kingsmill's on Dundas Street. He rented the building from John Walsingham Cook Meredith for a grand total of $400 per year. Thomas, Anne, and their 6 children lived at 862 Rideout Street North, a popular part of town for those in, or aspiring to be in, London's high society. Many said that Thomas was born for a life of service. He possessed superior knowledge about cloth and fabric, and spent years of his life traveling to Europe and back by boat to personally purchase cloth for his London, Ontario customers. He was said to have crossed the Atlantic Ocean 140 times for this purpose. More than stellar customer service, Kingsmill's store was one of the first in London to introduce a fair price system. Due to the fact that London was still a fairly new community in the 1860s, many businesses still operated on a barter system, which was prone to haggling, compromising, and bias. Thomas ensured that all of his goods were marked with one price only, in plain figures, a system which was soon to become the norm in London. This was certainly a mark of London's transition from a pioneer town to a bustling city. Besides being one of London's most prominent businessmen, Thomas also served as a city alderman from 1873 to 74, was active in creating London's first water commission, and was largely responsible for erecting Blackfriars Bridge, the first steel arch to span the Thames, near his Rideout Street home. Thomas passed away in 1915 of bladder disease, and it was then that another dramatic and scandalous feature of his life was revealed. Since his wife Anne had already passed away, he left his estate to his children. Before the funds could be distributed, another Mrs. Kingsmill stepped forward claiming to be Thomas's wife, and she and her 3 children rightfully entitled to a share of the estate. The details came out through a court case, in which the second Mrs. Kingsmill, born Margaret Gill, contested Thomas's will. She was living in England when she answered a newspaper ad and became Mr. Kingsmill's employee in 1883, eventually marrying him in Canada in 84 and returning to live in England. She was not notified that Thomas was already married until after the wedding. Thomas would spend most of the year in London, Ontario with Anne, but would live with Margaret while on his cloth-buying business trips to England. Margaret and Thomas had 3 children, Percy, Irene, and Vernon, who came to Canada in 1910 and took up residence in the first Kingsmill house when Thomas died. As one may expect, this did not go over well. It seems as if Canadians' new sense of themselves as global citizens had more than a few unexpected benefits. Despite this scandal and the bout of bad feeling that followed, the Kingsmill family continued to play a prominent role in London society. Thomas and Anne's son, Henry Ardagh Kingsmill, was a Confederation baby, having been born on July 2, 1867, the day after the First Dominion Day. Having grown up in a unified Canada, Henry studied medicine at the newly established University of Western Ontario, graduating in 1895. He was a practicing physician in London as well as in England, having inherited his father's penchant for travel. He enlisted in World War I in 1917, offering his skills as a physician and surgeon and serving in the Canadian Army Medical Corps. He was one of the few Londoners who made it through the war and was able to return home to London. However, he fell victim to the soldiers' influenza epidemic and never recovered. He lived out his last years at home, eventually dying of pneumonia brought on by Spanish influenza in 1920. He was buried at Woodland Cemetery with a veteran's headstone near the rest of the Kingsmill family. Henry Kingsmill was one of the majority of Londoners who passed away from a contagious disease. Confederation-era mortality rates were much higher than ours today. Death was a constant presence. This was mainly due to poor public health measures, poor sanitation, poor nutrition, and lack of vaccinations against diseases. The field of medicine was also not as advanced as we have come to enjoy. The main causes of death in London in the 1860s were tuberculosis, cholera, stillbirth, bronchitis, scarlet fever, lung disease, whooping cough, typhoid, and dysentery. Many women also died in childbirth, and many children during their teething period due to high fevers. Infants under 1 year accounted for more than 40% of all burials. The child mortality rate in Upper Canada was higher than it was in Europe due to the large influx of immigrants and the debilitating effects of urban environments like London's. It often took years for medical advancements and discoveries from Europe to be communicated to and implemented in Confederation-era Canada. Despite the efforts of well-trained doctors like Henry, Canada was still many years away from widespread public health measures and improved medical knowledge. London was also home to individuals who played a direct role in the politics of Confederation. One of these people was Thomas Scatcherd, whose family had founded the hamlet of Whiton when they immigrated to Canada from Yorkshire, England in the 1820s. Thomas's father, John Scatcherd, had been a justice of the peace, a warden of the county, and a member of Parliament. Big shoes to fill, but Thomas had no problem continuing his family's legacy. Thomas was born on November 10, 1823, and attended grammar school in London when he moved there with his family at age 7. At 17 years old, he decided that he wanted to enter the law profession and became an apprentice to William Horton. He eventually became town clerk for London in 1845, opened his own law practice in 1848, and became the official solicitor for the town of London in 1849, a position he held for the rest of his life. His personal character was often remarked upon by his friends. He was a very humble person, and, as William Horton said, he spoke with an eloquence and force rarely exceeded by any of his professional brethren. Though exceedingly wealthy, he was generous, and saved many of his friends from bankruptcy and social ruin when the Depression of 1856 hit by paying to save their businesses and homes. With the support of his family and community, Thomas decided to enter politics. His unbroken record of electoral success began when he ran in the riding of Middlesex West in 1861. He was a member of the Reform movement, which meant that he believed that political legislative councils, governors, and other officials should be appointed by democratic election. Many reformers were optimistic about Confederation, but on this issue Thomas followed his own beliefs. He was part of the debates about Confederation, and though he believed that the idea had some potential, he didn't want to rush into it without due caution, as he believed that Canada hadn't properly considered issues such as how debt may be unequally distributed amongst the new provinces. At points he went as far as to regard Confederation as a scheme to construct the intercolonial railway, and he believed that it would benefit the lower provinces, like Quebec, at the great expense of Canada West. As a reformer, he believed that Confederation should not happen unless the public voted on and approved it. This opinion put him in bad standing with Sir John A. Macdonald, who tried to have him opposed several times. However, the public went on to elect Scatcherd twice more, and he had a long and respectable career as an MP. Thomas died while he was in Ottawa on April 12, 1876, at the age of 52. His complete memoir and family history was published after his death by his prior mentor, William Horton, whose lifelong respect he had gained. It was not uncommon in the Confederation era to produce things, like Scatcherd's memoir, to honor someone who had died. People who lived in the mid-19th century had a closer relationship with death than we do today. Many more people died from diseases or accidents, and the art and literature of the day did its part to romanticize death. This was due in part to the Victorian mourning customs introduced by Queen Victoria when she lost her husband in 1861. In deep grief over the loss, she set the standard of wearing only black clothing, wearing a veil, and keeping mementos by which to remember the deceased. Following the Queen's lead, deep mourning became the fashion for the Victorian period up until the First World War. Funerals were usually extravagant and impressive events, and would have been especially so for someone of Thomas Scatcherd's standing, as funerals were meant to reflect the successes of an individual's life. The planning of the funeral was usually left to a close family friend, someone like William Horton, so as to remove the burden from the grieving family. Attendance at funerals was invitation only, but if needed, one could hire professional mourners to join the funeral procession to reflect the importance of the person who had died. After the funeral, people observed a period of mourning, which could last anywhere from 4 weeks to 2 years. Friends of Thomas Scatcherd would have worn black bands around their hats and arms for a number of weeks after his death. His wife, Isabella, would have worn black mourning clothing and a weeping veil for at least a year. People at the time of Confederation believed that these practices reflected their love for the person who had died, and allowed their spirit to pass safely over to the next world. Another Confederation-era politician buried at Woodland is Colonel John Walker. He was born on January 24, 1832, in Argyllshire, Scotland, and spent most of his young life there, in Glasgow, and in Leith. He married Janet McCaddy in Scotland, and they had 4 children, but she passed away soon after, likely in childbirth. After her death, John immigrated to Canada in 1864. He organized a militia company at Bothwell, County of Kent, Ontario, on the breaking out of the Fenian raids in 1866. He was subsequently transferred as captain to the 7th Fusiliers and moved to London in 1867. Once here, he took the city by storm. He was also an industrialist and erected a chemical works, began manufacturing sulfuric acid, and went into the oil refining business, which was very lucrative at the time. He was also the vice president of the Canadian Pacific Railway, vice president of the Ontario Rifle Association, director of the Ontario Savings and Loan Company and the Equitable Loan Company, the president of the School of Art and Design, the vice president of the London, Huron and Bruce Railway Company, director of the Imperial Oil Company, president of the St. Andrews Society, director of the City Gas Company and London Life Insurance Company, and one of the founders of the Protestants Orphan Home. He was connected with many of the charitable institutions of the city and was known for being a public-spirited individual and one of the city's most influential men. Interestingly, he is also noted as being the first to recommend the game of golf to Londoners. It is no wonder that he ended up in politics. Documents state that Colonel Walker had an aversion to politics and that he only ran for the House of Commons in 1874 to defend against the election of John Carling. Walker ran for the Liberal Party and defeated Carling by a majority of over 70 votes. During his brief time in office, he was a member of the Special Committee to inquire into the condition of Port Stanley Harbour, the Special Committee to inquire into the manufacturing interests of the Dominion, the Standing Committee on Banking and Commerce, and the Standing Committee on Railways, Canals, and Telegraph Lines. However, it seems that John Walker was not as disinterested in politics as he is portrayed in later accounts. Shortly after his election, he was accused of bribery and corruption, and the case was tried in court. It came to light that he and his political allies, including men like Thomas Smallman, George Reeves, and Edward Harris, had spent at least $9,000 bribing Londoners for votes. This is the equivalent of approximately $200,000 today. He was found to have illegally pulled at least 1,200 votes in this manner during his canvassing. Walker claimed to be entirely ignorant of the fact that the money had been spent on bribes, but, nevertheless, he was found guilty and unseated shortly after his election. He died in 1889 of paralysis at the age of 57. John Walker wasn't the only person to break the law in 1860s London, nor was he the most interesting. Though the looming Confederation was on everyone's minds, the talk of the town and the biggest sensation of the year was Slippery Jack. In 1869, Londoners started experiencing someone breaking into their homes. This burglar didn't steal anything, however. All they would do was cause mischief, piling a family's furniture in the middle of a room or turning everything upside down, making noise or screaming into sleeping people's ears and bolting. As these break-ins went on, the perpetrator, dubbed Slippery Jack in the newspapers, began tickling the feet of sleeping homeowners, especially those of young women. Slippery Jack evaded police for an entire year, making a laughingstock out of the London police force. A citizens' watch was formed, but Jack was never caught. The break-in stopped suddenly in September of 1868, and soon after, an anonymous letter was sent by Slippery Jack to be published in the London Advertiser. The letter explained that he had made a bet with some friends that he could enter London homes once a week for an entire year without getting caught. Seemingly remorseful, he offered to pay for any damage his shenanigans had caused, probably with the money he earned from winning the bet. It was later found out that Slippery Jack was a member of the Imperial Garrison, meaning that he likely returned to England with his garrison after Confederation was accepted. Another bad seed of the Confederation era, with a significantly darker story, has a special tie to Woodland Cemetery. His name was Thomas Francis, and he was born in Ireland sometime between 1803 and 1809. By the 1830s, he was living in North America, first in Nova Scotia and later in London. He worked as a marble carver and stone cutter, which meant that part of his time was spent carving intricate gravestones for the existing cemeteries. Several of the stones that he carved were placed in St. Paul's Grove Cemetery and eventually moved to Woodland, remaining here today. Shortly after he arrived in London, he married a young Englishwoman named Jane, who was over 20 years his junior. The pair had 3 sons, but it was an unhappy and troubled marriage. Thomas was unreasonably jealous and easily angered, often accusing Jane of being unfaithful. In the 1850s, he suffered a stroke, which impaired his right side and made it impossible for him to continue his job as a marble carver. Instead, he opened the Ivy Green Hotel in 1861, which was just west of the York Street Bridge on Stanley Street, and was well known to many travelers. This change of profession did nothing to curb his impossible behavior, and eventually Jane was able to obtain a legal separation from him in November 1866. He sold his hotel, which was bought by Jane and her family, who continued to run the hotel and live comfortably on the income. However, Thomas was unwilling to let his anger go. He visited the hotel often to try and reconcile with Jane, but was always unsuccessful. The tense situation built up until, on September 24, 1867, he returned to the hotel carrying a Colt pistol in his pocket. Once again, he attempted to get Jane to take him back, but she, for the last time, refused. The following events were described in the London Free Press. The conflicting designs, the frightful images then seething in his heated brain can be imagined as alike odious and shocking to God and man. He soon decided. He was seen to draw a Colt's revolver carefully from his pocket and retract his steps towards the sitting room, carrying the pistol in his left hand behind his back. On the threshold of the door he halted, was about to aim at Mrs. Francis where she sat, when she sprang forward with a loud scream and attempted to wrest the weapon from him. Before she reached him it was discharged, the ball entering the floor. She then turned and fled across the road to a neighbor's house. Francis then threatened to shoot his young son, who also fled to safety across the street. It was thought that, had his paralysis not forced him to use his left hand, he would have been successful in his attempted murder. Left alone in the front of the hotel, another shot was heard. Law enforcement entered to find Francis dead from a bullet to the head. He was buried in St. Paul's Grove Cemetery, but does not appear to have been furnished to gravestones like the one he carved during his life. Despite his disposition, the carvings that Thomas Francis completed for those buried in St. Paul's Cemetery are things of beauty. In the Confederation era, monuments were always hand-carved, which allowed families to personalize their gravestones with symbols and inscriptions that reflected the life the deceased had lived. A tremendous amount of thought went into the creation and execution of every gravestone. People would use symbolism to gesture towards a person's career, religious beliefs, relationships, or personality, leaving stories to be deciphered by visitors to the cemetery. Thomas Francis and other stonecutters of the era would have been well versed in the symbolism of death and dying. A stroll through Woodland's old sections reveals several Confederation-era symbols, such as weeping willows, which represent perpetual sorrow, broken columns, which symbolize a strong life cut short, pointing hands, which represent ascension into heaven, Masonic and fraternity symbols, and scrolls, which represent life's unfolding. It is lasting monuments like these very stones that make Woodland Cemetery a rich depository for London's Confederation history. The stones on our grounds are memoirs from a different time, bearing names 150 years into the future, in order that the stories of these Londoners may be uncovered and brought to light once again.